Imagine stepping into the heart of ancient Mesoamerica, where, instead of streets, you find yourself walking on water. A vast lake stretches before you, but what stands out most are the extraordinary, floating islands, lush with green crops, gliding gently on the surface. These aren't mere islands, they are Chinampas, an ancient form of farming so ingenious it helped feed one of the largest cities in the world, Tenochtitlan, now known as Mexico City. The Aztecs, the masterminds behind this floating agricultural marvel, transformed the lake into a thriving, dynamic ecosystem, allowing them to sustain not just a growing population, but a flourishing culture. And tonight, we're going to explore how these gardeners, in their unique floating world, managed to grow food for a bustling empire. By now, you're starting to realize that these Chinampas weren't just agricultural tools, they were intricate, living systems that supported the heartbeat of Tenochtitlan. These floating gardens, though serene on the surface, were the foundation of a city built on commerce, culture, and, most importantly, survival. Without them, the Aztec Empire could have crumbled under the weight of its own growing population, but somehow, they made it work, creating a truly sustainable and thriving civilization in the middle of a lake. But here's the kicker: the Chinampas weren't just about food, they were a symbol of power. The Aztecs used them as a kind of visual representation of their dominion over nature. They could literally transform a barren space into a flourishing agricultural paradise, and this act of creation was something that added to their prestige. It wasn't just about getting crops to grow, it was about showing that the Aztecs had control over their environment, that they could shape the world around them with their skill and willpower. Historians still argue about the exact role of the Chinampas in Aztec religion. While there's no definitive answer, it's clear that these floating farms had spiritual significance. The Aztecs viewed their relationship with nature as sacred. They believed that their gods, particularly Tlaloc, the god of rain and agriculture, were directly involved in their farming practices. In a way, the Chinampas might have been seen as a direct offering to the gods, a form of gratitude and respect for the life-giving crops they provided. This connection between land, food, and spirituality was as integral to the Aztec identity as their military might and their complex social structure. As you drift deeper into the story, imagine walking down one of the narrow canals that crisscrossed the city, flanked by Chinampas bursting with flowers, maize, beans, and squashes. The air would be filled with the sweet scent of the flowers, the earthy aroma of the wet soil, and the sounds of water lapping gently at the shores. It's hard to fathom how something so peaceful and beautiful could support an empire, but the Aztecs made it work. The floating farms weren't just about food production, they were a carefully constructed ecosystem that mirrored the Aztec worldview, a place where nature, religion, and survival came together in perfect harmony. It's incredible to think about the level of knowledge, skill, and dedication it took to maintain such an elaborate system. And yet, despite its beauty and brilliance, the Chinampas would eventually face their own set of challenges, setting the stage for the decline of one of the greatest civilizations in history. The clock of history ticks relentlessly, and the rise of the Chinampas, though spectacular, wasn't without its problems. While the floating gardens helped support the immense population of Tenochtitlan, they weren't invincible. The increasing pressure on these agricultural systems, combined with the demands of an ever-expanding empire, would eventually begin to take a toll. As you relax deeper, imagine the bustling markets of the city, now weighed down by the constant demands for food and resources. Every decision, every crop grown, was part of a delicate balance, and that balance was shifting. One of the biggest challenges for the Aztecs was the sheer amount of labor required to maintain the Chinampas. These floating farms didn't just thrive on their own, they needed constant care, meticulous tending, and regular rebuilding. The Chinampas were built on mud, which over time could erode or sink. Farmers would have to replenish the soil, add more mud, and ensure that the Chinampas didn't collapse under the weight of the crops. In a way, these floating farms were a living testament to the effort that went into sustaining the city, and yet, the labor-intensive nature of the project was both a blessing and a curse. But as you picture the workers moving between the Chinampas, tirelessly harvesting crops, planting seeds, and reinforcing the soil, it becomes clear that the system was not sustainable in the long run. As Tenochtitlan grew, The demand for more land, more food, more resources, intensified. To meet these needs, the Chinampas expanded, but at a cost. The canals, once pristine and clear, began to accumulate silt and debris, making navigation more difficult. Some Chinampas became overcrowded and lost their ability to thrive. But even with these setbacks, the Aztecs had a deep, almost spiritual connection to their land, and they pressed forward. Historians still debate whether the collapse of the Chinampas system was a contributing factor to the fall of Tenochtitlan. Some argue that as the city expanded, the very thing that once made it so unique, the intertwining of human ingenuity with the natural world, began to unravel. Others maintain that the collapse was a result of external factors, such as the Spanish conquest, that overwhelmed the complex system the Aztecs had worked so hard to maintain. Regardless of the cause, it's clear that the fall of the Chinampas mirrors the broader collapse of the Aztec Empire, a once thriving civilization brought to its knees by forces it couldn't control. As the day drifts into night, imagine the shadow of a great empire slowly starting to fade. The vibrant canals, once teeming with life and abundance, now become still and silent, their waters a reflection of the fading power of Tenochtitlan. The once immense markets, now empty, whisper of a time when the Chinampas fed not just a city, but an entire empire. The beauty of the floating farms, now a distant memory, serves as a reminder of what was once achieved and what was ultimately lost. As you relax deeper into the rhythm of this story, imagine the last days of Tenochtitlan, when the mighty Chinampas were slowly becoming shadows of their former selves. Picture the vast marketplace that once buzzed with traders, filled with the sounds of bartering, laughter, and the rich smells of freshly harvested food. The canals that wound their way through the heart of the city, once teeming with the vibrant energy of Aztec life, are now eerily quiet. The heart of Tenochtitlan is still, and you can almost feel the weight of history pressing down. But let's pause for a moment. Do you remember how the Chinampas were built? Picture yourself back in that time, standing near the shores of Lake Texcoco, where the first attempts at creating these floating farms were made. The Aztecs, not satisfied with the traditional farming methods on solid ground, turned to the water itself to create a vast agricultural network. They piled mud and reeds into the water, using the natural materials at their disposal. The result, a network of small, artificial islands that could grow crops, sustain the population, and even provide a way to manage water. The ingenuity was extraordinary, a testament to the Aztecs' deep understanding of their environment. But over time, the relentless expansion of the city began to push the Chinampas to their limits. As the population swelled, so did the demands on the farms. The canals became increasingly difficult to navigate as silt and debris clogged the waterways. The once fertile soil, essential for the growth of crops, began to degrade under the constant pressure. The Chinampas required constant care and rebuilding, but the resources needed to maintain them were strained. This is where the cracks began to show. Though not immediately apparent, the Aztecs, brilliant in many ways, could not foresee that their agricultural system, so intricately woven into the fabric of the city, might one day buckle under the pressure of its own success. Historians still argue over whether the collapse of the Chinampas directly contributed to the downfall of Tenochtitlan. Some believe that it was the Spanish conquest that caused the city to fall, while others maintain that the environmental toll of such a complex and demanding agricultural system played a significant role. But one thing is certain, the Chinampas were both a triumph of human ingenuity and a symbol of the limitations of even the most brilliant civilizations. They were a symbol of what had been achieved, but also of the fragility of human endeavors in the face of time, nature, and unforeseen change. Now, picture the moment when the Spanish arrived. The once vibrant canals, which had been the lifeblood of Tenochtitlan, were now silent. The floating farms, once the city's agricultural backbone, had begun to show signs of wear. The Aztecs were still resilient, but the cracks in their society were beginning to deepen. As the Spanish forces closed in, the Chinampas, once a symbol of strength and prosperity, now reflected the vulnerability of the city. Historians still debate what role the Spanish conquest played in the ultimate collapse of the Chinampas, but what's clear is that the rise and fall of Tenochtitlan is a story of ambition, innovation, and the eventual price of both. The Chinampas served as a testament to the ingenuity of a people who could create thriving agricultural systems in a city surrounded by water. Yet, in the end, these very same floating gardens so vital to the life of the city became symbols of a civilization that had reached its peak, only to be swept away by the tides of history. Now, let's slip even deeper into the shadows of history, beyond the sounds of a bustling marketplace, beyond the vibrant canals that once flowed with life. Imagine, if you will, the day when the great city of Tenochtitlan, home to a civilization of unprecedented complexity and sophistication, finally came to its devastating end. As we drift through these final moments, take a deep breath, and let the weight of this story settle over you like a soft blanket, enveloping your senses in the remnants of a world long gone. The Spanish conquest of the Aztec Empire, a tale of ambition, conquest, and unimaginable destruction, was the beginning of the end for Tenochtitlan. Led by Hern A tilde inverted exclamation mark and Court A tilde copyright S, the Spanish forces arrived in 1519, drawn by the promise of gold and a thirst for power. But it wasn't just the Spanish military might that threatened the city. There was something more insidious at work. Diseasey smallpox swept through the population, decimating the Aztec people at an alarming rate. The virus, which the Aztecs had no immunity against, ravaged the population, weakening the empire in its final days. Picture the scene as the Aztec warriors, once so proud and skilled in battle, found themselves overwhelmed, not just by the Spanish steel but by an invisible enemy they couldn't fight. The city's once thriving canals, the heart of the Chinampa system, began to look like ghosts of a more prosperous time. The water, once teeming with life, now reflected only the destruction that had taken root. But this wasn't the end yet. As the Aztecs fell, the Chinampas, those floating islands of life and sustenance, became the stage for a tragic final act. The Spanish forces, aware of the significance of the canals and the strategic advantage they offered, used them to their advantage, trapping the Aztec defenders in their own city. Court A tilde copyright S's forces surrounded Tenochtitlan, cutting off access to the water and preventing supplies from entering. The once immense Chinampa system, which had nourished the city, now became a battleground, a symbol of the collapse of an entire civilization. Historians still debate the role of the Chinampas in the final siege of Tenochtitlan. Some argue that the floating farms could have been a crucial lifeline, offering a potential escape or an alternative way to bring in supplies. Others believe that the water's role was merely incidental, overshadowed by the overwhelming force of the Spanish siege. Either way, it is clear that the city's once thriving agricultural system was no longer enough to save it. The Spanish forces took control of the canals, the Chinampas, and eventually the city itself. As the Aztec civilization crumbled, so did the system that had sustained it. The fall of Tenochtitlan marked the end of an era for the Aztecs, and the Chinampas, once a symbol of human innovation, faded into history. Yet, in the quiet aftermath of the conquest, the legacy of the Chinampas lived on in the land that would soon be reshaped by the hands of colonizers. The Spanish victory over the Aztecs was not just a military conquest, it was the beginning of a transformation that would ripple through the centuries. But in the silence of the canals, in the ruins of the once vibrant floating farms, there remains a haunting reminder of a world that was lost. The Chinampas had been a testament to human ingenuity, but they were also a symbol of the fragility of empires. You might think farming on water sounds like a fantasy, but to the Aztecs, it was their lifeline, a practical, innovative solution to the challenges they faced in an ever-expanding metropolis. The city, built on the shores of Lake Texcoco, had limited space for farming, and the land around the lake was either marshy or difficult to cultivate. But, with creativity, determination, and a touch of nature's magic, the Aztecs managed to create an intricate system of floating gardens that turned water into arable land. This wasn't just agriculture, it was a feat of engineering, environmental management, and cultural innovation. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, let me know where you're tuning in from and the time there. I'd love to hear about your location. Ready? Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's drift a little deeper into this remarkable world. Imagine the faint sound of water lapping against the edges of the floating Chinampas as you step closer to the garden. It's peaceful here, almost surreal, except that what you're standing on isn't solid ground. It's a complex network of man-made islands, each one carefully crafted from mud, reeds, and other materials pulled from the lake bed. The Aztec gardeners, known as Chinampas, were no strangers to working in harmony with nature, and their floating gardens reflected this delicate balance. At the heart of Chinampa farming was its ingenious design. The islands were created by piling layers of mud and plant material, anchored to the lake's bottom using large, wooden posts. Over time, these islands became solid enough to support the growth of crops, creating a highly productive farming system. These floating farms could grow food year-round, thanks to their ability to retain moisture and nutrients from the lake. The soil on a Chinampa, refreshed with every harvest, became an ever more fertile surface for cultivating a wide variety of crops. So, even during the dry season, when most of Mesoamerica would experience food shortages, the Chinampas provided a steady, reliable supply of food. Historians still argue over how exactly the Aztecs mastered the delicate art of managing the Chinampa system, but what's clear is that they did so with remarkable success. Not only did they grow the staple crops like maize, beans, and squash, but they also cultivated fruit trees, flowers, and medicinal plants. Everything they needed to survive, and much more, was grown in these floating gardens. You can almost picture it, rows upon rows of lush, green crops dotting the water, a gentle breeze blowing across the lake, and the hum of Tenochtitlan's bustling streets in the background. It's peaceful and productive, a living, breathing testament to the Aztecs' ingenuity. Now, let's pause for a moment and take in the full picture of what's happening here. The Chinampas weren't just a patch of fertile land floating in the middle of a lake. They were the lifeblood of the Aztec Empire, the key to feeding a population of several 100,000 people in Tenochtitlan. And while they might seem like a serene agricultural paradise, managing these floating farms was a massive task, one that involved a combination of hard work, precision, and an almost spiritual relationship with the land and water. You're standing in a city surrounded by these floating gardens, but you're also standing on the edge of an agricultural revolution. Each Chinampa was meticulously planned. Not only did the gardeners have to know exactly what crops would thrive in the watery conditions, but they also had to master the art of rotating crops and managing the soil's nutrient levels. It was a dynamic, multi-layered process. First, the gardeners would cultivate the land on the Chinampa, and then, after a few years, the soil would be replenished with fresh mud from the lake bed. This process allowed the soil to retain its fertility. Unlike the traditional farming methods that deplete the land over time, talk about sustainable farming, historians are still in awe of how efficient the system was. It's said that the Chinampas produced as much as 7 harvests a year. Imagine that. A farmer working in a typical field might only get 2 or 3 harvests, but these floating gardens were harvesting crops multiple times a year, keeping the people of Tenochtitlan well-fed and thriving. But the agricultural genius of the Aztecs didn't stop with growing crops. They understood the importance of biodiversity and intercropping. Different plants supported each other's growth. For example, beans helped to enrich the soil with nitrogen, while squash spread over the soil and kept it cool. You could call this the first version of crop rotation and companion planting, practices we still use today in modern agriculture. It's hard not to marvel at how much work went into creating these fertile islands. And yet, as complex and labor-intensive as it was, the whole system functioned as an integrated, well-oiled machine. The Chinampas were more than just farming plots, they were a testament to the Aztecs' dedication, ingenuity, and deep respect for the natural world. Now, let the rhythm of history slow as we draw closer to the quiet aftermath of the fall of Tenochtitlan. The city, which had once shimmered with the colors of life, art, and agriculture, now lay in ruins. The Chinampas, those floating marvels of engineering, had not only supported the people of Tenochtitlan but had become entwined with the identity of the Aztec civilization itself. As the sun set over the ruins of the once great capital, imagine the long shadow it cast, a symbol of what was lost in the wake of European conquest. In the years that followed, the Spanish began their work of colonization, a process that would forever change the landscape of Mexico. They sought to erase much of the Aztec legacy, replacing it with their own ideals of Christianity and European governance. But while the city of Tenochtitlan disappeared beneath the hands of the Spanish, its memory, and the memory of its incredible agricultural systems, lived on in subtle ways. The Chinampas, despite their tragic end in the wake of the conquest, were not entirely forgotten. They were too ingenious, too effective, to be wiped away completely. As the Spanish established their new colonial order, they realized that the land around them was not as barren as they once believed. The canals, once essential to the Aztec agricultural system, were reclaimed, and the idea of using these floating farms in the marshy lake areas was reborn. The conquerors, having defeated the Aztecs, now turned to their methods for survival. Historians argue about the extent to which the Spanish utilized the Chinampas after the conquest. Some suggest that the floating gardens were initially viewed with skepticism, their origins tied to the people the Spanish sought to dominate. Others maintain that the practical nature of the Chinampas was undeniable, and as European settlers struggled to grow crops in the unfamiliar terrain, they eventually embraced the Aztec system. What is certain, however, is that the Chinampas persisted in some form, continuing to nourish the people of the valley long after the fall of the Aztec Empire. Though the Spanish colonizers set about building their empire on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, they could not entirely erase the memory of the Aztecs' brilliance. The floating farms, woven into the fabric of Mexican agriculture, lived on. Though their ownership had shifted, the Chinampas became a symbol not just of agricultural innovation but of resiliency, of the resilience of a people whose legacy could not be fully erased, even in the face of conquest and oppression. In time, the Chinampas would evolve, adapting to the needs of new generations. They would continue to provide food and sustenance, not just for the indigenous people, but also for the growing Spanish and Mestizo populations that made up the New Mexico. And yet, in the quiet spaces of the land, the whispers of the Aztec gardeners could still be heard. They had fed a city, and they would continue to feed a country long after the fall of their empire. So now, as you begin to drift off, imagine the waters of the Xochimilco canals, still flowing quietly through the heart of Mexico City today, carrying with them the legacy of a civilization that once thrived here. The Chinampas, though no longer the centerpiece of an empire, still dot the landscape, a reminder of the ingenuity that once fed a city with floating farms. As you continue to relax, imagine the slow, rhythmic pulse of the Xochimilco canals. Picture yourself gently drifting over the water in a brightly painted boat, the sounds of nature surrounding you, with the chirping of birds, the rustle of leaves, and the soft lapping of water against the boat's sides. This tranquil scene is a far cry from the bustling heart of Tenochtitlan that once stood here, but the connection to the past remains strong. You see, even after the fall of the Aztec Empire, the Chinampas remained an important part of Mexican culture and agriculture. In the centuries following the Spanish conquest, these floating farms continued to be used by the people who lived around Mexico City, evolving and adapting to the changing landscape. The people of the area, both indigenous and mestizo, found that the Chinampas were an ideal solution to the challenges posed by the region's marshy environment. While many of the other aspects of Aztec civilization were lost or diminished, the Chinampas of those floating islands of fertility survived. Historians argue that their survival was in part due to their practicality. The canals and floating gardens not only provided a steady food source, but they also helped to manage the area's wetlands, preventing flooding and preserving the delicate balance of the ecosystem. The Spanish, when they arrived, did not immediately understand the full potential of the Chinampas. Initially, they preferred the European methods of agriculture, which relied on plowing large tracts of land, but over time, they began to see the advantages of the Aztec system. It was far more efficient than the region's environment. The Chinampas required less water, allowed for multiple harvests per year, and were immune to the kind of soil depletion that European farming methods often faced. In the centuries that followed, the Chinampas grew in importance once again, especially in the development of Mexico City. The areas surrounding the canals, known as Xochimilco, became one of the most fertile regions in the country, feeding not only the city but also serving as a model for sustainable farming in other parts of the world. This revival of the Chinampas, however, was not without challenges. As you imagine the boats floating on the Xochimilco canals, let the idea of resilience wash over you. The Chinampas survived centuries of change, from the Aztec Empire to the Spanish colonization and even into the modern day. They've endured because of their connection to the land, to the water, and to the people who relied on them for sustenance. But like all things in life, they have not remained untouched by the pressures of modernity. Urbanization and industrialization have encroached on the canal systems, threatening the Chinampas' existence. Yet, in the face of these threats, the floating farms continue to stand as a testament to ingenuity and the enduring spirit of the people who have nurtured them for generations. As you slowly let the images of the canals fade away, remember that the Chinampas are more than just a farming technique. They are a piece of living history, a symbol of the relationship between people and the land that sustains them. They are a reminder of the perseverance of cultures and the quiet, enduring beauty of nature's cycles. Now, as you picture the floating farms drifting lazily in the warm sunlight, allow yourself to drift deeper into relaxation, imagining the history of these resilient gardens continuing to unfold before you. The Chinampas are not just a historical curiosity, they are a living, breathing part of the world today, providing fresh produce and a link to the past that stretches back centuries. They offer an important lesson about sustainability, balance, and the deep connection between humans and the earth. As the centuries passed, the Chinampas, though still used for agriculture, became increasingly threatened by the changing landscape of Mexico City. Urban sprawl, pollution, and the growing demands of a rapidly modernizing world began to take their toll. The canals that had once flowed freely were dammed, and much of the natural wetlands were drained to make room for new construction projects. In some areas, the Chinampas became mere relics, surrounded by the expanding cityscape. Yet, in Xochimilco, the heart of the Chinampa system, there remained a stubborn dedication to preserving these gardens. Families who had worked the canals for generations continued to plant their crops on the floating islands, passing down their knowledge and skills from one generation to the next. And despite the encroachment of modernity, these floating farms have endured. Historians still argue about the degree to which the Aztecs relied on Chinampas for their food supply. Some believe that the floating gardens were vital to the sustenance of Tenochtitlan, feeding as much as 30,000 people a day. Others believe that they were just one part of a broader, more complex agricultural system. But what everyone agrees on is that the Chinampas were a testament to the ingenuity and resourcefulness of the Aztecs. Today, the Chinampas continue to provide food to the people of Mexico City, with fresh vegetables and flowers being grown on the very canals that once served the mighty Aztec Empire. Modern agricultural techniques have taken root, but the Chinampas remain a model of sustainable farming. They are a reminder that the old ways are not always outdated, but rather can coexist with innovation, blending tradition and technology to create something greater than the sum of its parts. As you imagine the boats gliding across the canals, bringing fresh produce to the bustling markets of Mexico City, take a moment to appreciate the lasting impact of the Chinampas. Despite the trials and tribulations of history, these floating gardens are still alive. They are a reminder of resilience, adaptability, and the timeless connection between people and the land. Even as you let the sounds of the canals and the boats fade away, remember that the Chinampas are not just a footnote in history. They are a living legacy, a link between the past and the present, offering a glimpse into a sustainable future rooted in the practices of ancient civilizations. Now that the Chinampas' story has drifted into the present, imagine the vibrant markets where the fruits of these gardens reach the hands of those who need them. Picture yourself walking through the crowded streets, the air thick with the scent of fresh flowers, herbs, and ripe vegetables, each a testament to the ingenuity of the Aztecs and the families who continue to preserve their legacy. The canals, once part of a grand empire, have transformed into a peaceful oasis amid the chaos of modern Mexico City. But beneath the tranquility lies a complex history of struggle, survival, and adaptation. For centuries, the Chinampas were a symbol of the Aztec Empire's power and prowess. They were not merely a method of farming, as they were a demonstration of the Aztec people's deep connection to the land. In a world where much of the population lived in large, tightly packed cities, food security was a constant challenge. Yet, the Aztecs managed to sustain their population with ingenious farming techniques that allowed them to make the most out of the scarce land available. They recognized that the land had limits, and the Chinampas represented a way to work within those limits rather than exploit them. Historians still debate the methods behind the construction of the Chinampas. Some suggest that the floating islands were a result of advanced agricultural knowledge passed down through generations, while others point to influence